Scaling Up for a Sustainable Food Future, hosted by the Rostandi Center for Social Sector Innovation at the University of Chicago Booth School of Business. I'm Christina Hachikian. I am the founding executive director of the Rostandi Center, as well as an adjunct associate professor of strategy at Chicago Booth. If you happen to be somebody who is interacting with the Rostandi Center for the first time, I just want to tell you a little bit about us. We are the social impact hub at Booth for people committed to tackling complex social and environmental problems, as well as an important part of the university's social impact ecosystem. Our mission is to promote innovation, advance research, and develop the people and practices that can accelerate social change. We are excited to host today's event alongside a diverse group of partners from across the university, the Kellstadt Center for Marketing at Chicago Booth, the Polsky Center for Entrepreneurship and Innovation, the college's Program on Global Environment at the University of Chicago, the University of Chicago Medicine and Biological Sciences, and EPIC, the Energy Policy Institute at the University of Chicago. I just want to thank all of our partners for bringing this event to life today. So, as you are certainly aware, over the past few months, the world has dramatically shifted. You out there may be grappling with many challenges personally or professionally, including changing organizational priorities, an uncertain future, maybe even health concerns, among others. And if you're here today, if you're taking the time to be with us, you're probably also concerned about the global challenges this pandemic will present, and importantly, the existing challenges that it will certainly compound. Maybe you're even asking yourself, what does this mean for global challenges that already seem insurmountable? What role can I play in addressing these challenges? And maybe how can I make a positive global impact during this time? Well, Dr. Pat Brown, a triple University of Chicago alumnus, wrestled with these exact questions when he was standing at the crossroads of his professional journey. He asked himself, how can I use my knowledge and experience as a physician and professor of biochemistry to make the largest positive impact on the world? His answer was bold. Leave academia to start a company that would reverse climate change and halt the collapse of biodiversity. Today, that company, Impossible Foods, has a lofty goal: to entirely replace animals in the food system by 2035. To achieve this goal, Dr. Brown is leading a global movement towards plant-based food. In pursuit of this goal, he and his team have raised $1.3 billion, and they've developed their flagship product, Impossible Burger, which is now sold in thousands of restaurants and grocery stores, with many additional products hitting stores around the way. Moreover, Dr. Brown is leaning into a market-based approach towards food sustainability. And his approach is providing a unique roadmap for other entrepreneurs trying to make a positive difference for humanity. And we are excited to be here today to dig into these topics and more with Dr. Brown, who will also be joined by Chicago Booth professor, Dr. Sanjog Misra. They will discuss Pat's journey from academia to entrepreneurship to worldwide impact, Impossible Foods' current scaling efforts, how its customers make decisions, and the role Impossible Foods hopes to play in both shaping the future of the food system and mitigating climate change. Before I introduce our panelists and we kick things off, I just want to give you a couple of quick logistics for today. Our panelists are going to start by discussing a series of questions, and Professor Misra will leave time at the end to take questions from the audience. So we encourage you to submit questions through for our panelists via the Q&A chat function within Zoom. Please include your name and where you're tuning in from. If you're a University of Chicago graduate, we'd also love to know your school, the school or program you graduated from, and your graduation year. Again, we're going to try to get to as many questions as time allows. So now I have the distinct pleasure to introduce you to our panelists. As I said, Dr. Brown is a 3-time university degree recipient, having received his BA, MD, and PhD in biochemistry at the University of Chicago. He is currently the founder and CEO of Impossible Foods. Prior to launching his company, he was an investigator and professor of biochemistry at the Stanford University School of Medicine. Dr. Brown completed a residency here in Chicago in pediatrics at Chicago's Children's Memorial Hospital, which is now Lurie Children's. In these roles, his research work focused on pioneering the use of gene expression patterns to classify cancers and improve prediction of their clinical course. Dr. Brown is also the founder of the Public Library of Science, a co-founder of Lyrical Foods, Inc., a member of the National Academy of Sciences and the Institute of Medicine, and a recipient of the American Cancer Society Medal of Honor. Professor Misra is currently the Charles H. Kellstadt Professor of Marketing at Chicago Booth, where he teaches courses on algorithmic marketing and focuses his research on the use of machine learning, deep learning, and structural econometric methods to study consumers and firm decision-making. He's partnered with research with Oath, Verizon, Eli Lilly, and more, and is an advisor to several startups in the marketing technology, measurement, and AI space. With that, thank you again for being with us today, and please join me in welcoming Pat and Sanjog.
Thank you, Christina. And first off, welcome, Pat. I'd like to just start by saying how excited I am to be talking to you. And thanks for speaking with us today and taking time out of what I'm sure is a very busy schedule. So let's get this going. Let me start by just asking you about your journey. I read somewhere that a quote from you about picking a problem that kind of matters to the world and kind of sticking to it. Can you speak a little bit about, your choice of the problem that you wanted to deal with and how Impossible Foods is kind of the solution to that problem?
Sure. I guess when it's been true kind of throughout my career that I've always felt like I wanted to work on problems that would have, where I could have the maximum possible positive impact. And really, I never felt that, people ask me what my job was, I never liked answering like, I'm a scientist, I'm a professor and so forth, because I always felt like my job is basically wherever I can have the most impact. And that's why, I've changed research directions a number of times, and at an earlier time, I, worked on a project that I was completely unqualified to do, which was to found a scientific publisher to launch a new business model and try to fix the total ridiculousness of the incumbent scientific publication system. And the point was, and I think there's a point there, which is that a lot of the things I've done, no one would have thought, including me, that I was particularly qualified to do, except that I had the most important qualification, which was that I decided to do it and took the initiative and was determined to make it succeed. And this was kind of the same deal with Impossible Foods. In my previous career, mostly I had been doing basic research and just sort of understanding how cells work and how genes work and developing tools for that and then looking for potential applications in medicine and so forth. And I love that stuff. And frankly, if it had nothing to do with having a positive impact on the world, and it was just like, how can you amuse yourself? That's probably what I would be doing. I'd have my lab in my garage and I'd just be playing around that way. But, and the one thing for sure was that I never had any interest in going into the business world. I didn't have anything against it. Like people, assume that I somehow have some contempt for that, which I absolutely don't. I just had no interest in doing it myself. It just seemed like, compared to the job I had, I just feel like that just sounds so boring, running a business and so forth, and compared to what I get to do. And I also didn't have a lot of interest in food. I spent very little time thinking about food. I've literally never taken a photograph of my meal in my entire life. So I was like, in some sense, completely unqualified to found a company that is focused on making and selling food. But again, I feel like I had the most important qualification, which was that I was determined to do it. And in this case, as you're, as you know, the impetus for doing that was that I think like 11 years ago, I had a sabbatical, and at that time I was, doing very basic research, and I just wanted to pick the most important problem that I could contribute to solving, with no boundaries on what that problem might be. And as I looked into it, I very quickly realized that the first condition, the most important problem in the world, was a no-brainer. By far the biggest environmental threat that humans have ever faced is the catastrophic impact of the use of animals as a food technology. And I can elaborate on that if you want, but that was completely apparent that not only is it a huge contributor to greenhouse gas emissions, and by far the biggest source of water pollution and consumption, the land footprint of land-based animal agriculture is about 45% of the entire land surface of Earth, as a result of which it is not almost virtually entirely responsible for a catastrophic collapse in global biodiversity on land. And for aquatic species, it's overfishing virtually entirely. So in other words, in both cases, use of animals as a food technology. But the opportunity cost of that land footprint is the opportunity to turn back the clock on climate change. Because if you could vaporize that industry today, which I would do in a heartbeat, the recovery of biomass on that 45% of Earth's land surface, where biomass is greatly reduced compared to pre-agricultural times. I mean, just think about a field that grows corn or soybeans. During the winter, it's bare dirt, basically. There's no biomass there. And grazing land is greatly depleted. If you look at the Amazon, where the farmers are burning it to turn it into grazing land for their cattle, and compare the Amazon rainforest to the resulting pastures. That's the biomass deficit. If you could vaporize that industry and let the biomass recover, it would outpace fossil fuel emissions. It would literally immediately begin reducing atmospheric CO2 concentrations, and you can do the math on that. We desperately need that, because when you look at the pathetic progress toward any kind of global commitment to greenhouse gas reduction, basically the best they can do in terms of commitment is, commits us to global temperature rises that put us at huge risk of catastrophic events. Why are we signing on to that? There really is the possibility to do much better than that, and that is to bring the atmospheric greenhouse gas levels down. And the opportunity cost of using all that land for animal agriculture is sacrificing the opportunity to turn back the clock on climate change. So anyway, sorry, I told you I might be a little tangential here, but the basic point is, it is by far the most destructive technology and the most destructive industry on Earth. And nobody was seriously trying to solve it. It wasn't even on anyone's agenda, including the COP, climate conventions and so forth. And so I felt like, well, screw this. I mean, we got to be working on this. And the other thing about it is that it had been framed as, well, we got to get people to change their diets, or we've got to compel people in that business to stop doing it, and so forth. And that's just like crazy. I mean, that is never going to work. And a perfect example is China asked its citizens to cut back their meat and dairy consumption by 50%, something like 3 years ago. and what's happened as a result is absolutely nothing. I mean, the demand for those foods has actually continued to go up just as fast as ever. It hasn't come down. People are very wedded to the foods that they prefer. For most, I would say for a large fraction of people in the world, the pleasure that they get from eating the foods they love is a huge part of the pleasure of life. And it's unreasonable to think you can ask them to give that up. And that defined the problem very crisply for me, which is that it's a technology problem. The problem is that we're using prehistoric technology that's the most inefficient technology at any scale around, hasn't improved in 1,000 years fundamentally in its efficiency, to produce this category of foods for which there's huge global demand. And there's no reason we ought not to be able to produce the same foods with the same quality or greater quality vastly more efficiently by basically turning plants directly into these foods, as opposed to, with 3% efficiency, as is the case with beef. So I thought that was doable, and therefore I figured, okay, it's too important for me not to do. So I quit my dream job and basically said, I'm just all in on this, and I'm going to figure out how to make it happen. And it clearly had to be a market-based solution in order to be able to scale, in order to be able to happen as quickly as possible. And really importantly, it had to not require people at any scale buying into my concerns about climate change or biodiversity or the things that are motivating me. Because most people don't, or many people don't really give a shit about that stuff. And it had to be something where the motivation for consumers is exactly what currently motivates them in their food choices: deliciousness, nutritional value, affordability, convenience, and so forth. I felt like that was a solvable problem scientifically. It's a biochemical problem. How do we efficiently turn these proteins and fats and materials from plants into something that delivers what meat lovers want? And I didn't know how we were going to do it. I just knew it was a solvable problem, and the most important scientific problem on Earth right now. The most important scientific problem. And the most important scientific question, I would say, is what makes meat delicious? Because nutrition and affordability is easy. There is enough protein in this year's soybean crop, more than enough. There's 60% more protein in this year's soybean crop than all the meat and animal foods consumed globally, okay? And it's grown on 0.8% of Earth's land area. And a minuscule fraction of resource use and so forth delivers all the primary nutrition that people get from meat, and at a tiny fraction of the cost, because the costs of making a pig are growing massive amounts of soybeans and turning them very inefficiently into a pig. So from a nutritional and economic standpoint, the problem has long since been solved. The tough problem is deliciousness, and that's where most of our research is focused.
So,
okay, I'm done.
So it seems like a logical, progression of like finding the problem and then ideation of this solution, which was, let's figure out a veggie burger that kind of tastes like meat. And
nope, let me interrupt there, sorry.
Okay, no worries.
That was not at all what we were trying to do. It was to make the most delicious meat on Earth directly from plants. And you can ask me the question, but I think what we think of ourselves as doing, as making meat, a better way of making meat, okay? And we know that to consumers, what they love about meat is not how it's made, it's what it is, okay? Right. And we want to make that thing that they love and just do it a different way. Yeah.
So
okay, not a veggie burger. Yeah.
Fair enough. I'll take that back. So was it easy enough kind of getting this off the ground? I know you have some pretty heavy hitters in terms of investors like Khosla Ventures and Bill Gates. Like, was this pitch an easy sell? What was the challenge in just getting this off the ground?
Actually, it felt pretty easy to me. And I was a total amateur, novice. In retrospect, I did a lot of things that, knowing more about the business world now, I would have done differently. But basically, I had the good fortune from creating a startup standpoint of living in sort of the epicenter of venture capital. And you literally, in Palo Alto, you can't walk a block without tripping over a venture capitalist. So there's very high target density for fundraising here. And so I, through people I know, talked to 3 of the big VC firms. And basically my pitch was completely amateurish. It was just something I just put together on my computer. I didn't read any books about, how do you do a pitch or any of that stuff. And I just laid out the problem that we were trying to solve, which wasn't the problem of the investors. The investors are trying to solve the problem of making money for their LPs and themselves, okay? And I was pitching solving this big global problem that, I think that the people I talked to who were good people, they cared about, but that was not what they were in the business of doing. And only at the very end, I think, did I give the point that I should have started with, which is, this is at the time a $1.5 trillion global market that is being served by demonstrably insanely inefficient technology that is prehistoric and hasn't fundamentally improved in millennia. And this project effectively, that's not how I had framed it in my head, but effectively is developing technology to capture a $1.5 trillion global market that is basically a sitting duck to be taken down by better technology. I spent most of my pitch basically talking about the environment and all the reasons that I wanted to do this and stuff like that. It's probably maybe other people make that mistake in their pitches. Fortunately, they cut me a break on it. And I didn't also, by the way, I had no idea how to solve this problem. I had some ideas, but it was basically, I acknowledged, I don't know if any of this stuff is going to work, but we're going to solve the problem. It's a solvable problem. I'm going to put together a bunch of good scientists and we're going to do it, basically. Don't try this at home. I just got lucky.
So by any metric, like there's no denying that Impossible Foods has been a success. In fact, more broadly, there's this, growth in kind of the plant-based industry, if you will. Today, it's maybe about $25 to $29 billion. Projections are that it's going to be $50 billion by 2025, growing at almost 10%. What's changed, like in your view? What's happening that kind of this is taken off? Is it the science that you've brought to the table? Is it kind of people's preferences shifting? Is it more awareness of the problems in the world like you had? Like, what do you think is going on that you've seen this massive growth in this industry?
I mean, I have some ideas about it. I think it's a very interesting question, and it would be worth someone actually doing research to try to understand it on sort of a sociological level. But basically, I think that there are a number of contributing factors, and I'll just focus on the meat part of it. There's dairy and other parts. The number of people who self-identify in the U.S. as vegetarian or vegan hasn't really changed materially in the past, since I've been doing this. Okay, so that's just a point to know. And it's a low single-digit percent. But for one thing, the way we approached the problem was to say, look, so all the plant-based foods that have been developed in the past, I can tell you what was in them, because I know some of these people, what was in the heads of the companies that were producing them. Their target consumer is someone who's looking for an alternative, okay? And i.e. people who, in some sense, want to have a more vegetarian or a vegetarian diet or something like that. Well, if that's your consumer, in order to be successful, first of all, you're not going to have any effect on the climate issues because you gotta. That's a very finite population. And secondly, the game you're playing is we have to be incrementally better than the next best plant-based product. Okay,
Right.
and that pretty much guarantees that your market is people who are willing to compromise on deliciousness because of some other motivation. That was never going to work for us. We have to deliver for a committed meat eater who is not looking for an alternative. They're just looking for the most delicious, healthy, affordable meat they can buy, given their taste. And so, because we needed to vastly expand the scope of people who would voluntarily choose our products over what's on the market. And as a result, that's why we initially treated this as a pure research problem. We had, before we launched our first product, we had something like 80 research scientists, something like half of them had PhDs or doctoral degrees, super great scientists, treating this as a hard scientific problem. We're not going to solve this problem by mushing a bunch of peas and carrots together and forming it into a patty. And that's really the way, and in terms of dairy products, it's the same thing on our end, is that, you can make something that is vaguely milk-like by grinding up, soybeans or almonds or whatever, that you get away with that for people who are looking for an alternative. But if you want to win over the people who are supporting the current dairy industry, which is our mission, you have to do a step function better in terms of we're not going to persuade the customers to compromise to come and buy our product. It's on us to make a product that they define what they want. We don't get to tell them to change your preferences and to make a product that delivers what they want. We have to kind of come to them instead of the other way around. And so I think that mindset, which is how we approach the problem, has been responsible for our success.
Right.
And it's the mindset for all our future products, which is, we have a product that well over 40% of meat eaters in the blind taste test prefer over the cow version. And we are not satisfied with it at all. So we're working hard. We're not satisfied until the vast majority of people, it's a no-brainer. This is clearly superior in delivering what we want from meat. And I'll just add also with the product that we have now, when meat eaters try it, the majority of them become repeat customers. Mm-hmm. So we know, we know this is the right approach, okay? But we're never going to stop getting better. And I think when you look at the plant-based products that are on the market, a large fraction of them were developed 20 years ago, and basically they're just chugging along. No one's trying to make them better because they have their market, and there you go. I think following our success, there have been I think there's been a mind, shift in the whole plant-based food industry, which is that the real customer is the hardcore meat eater, not the vegetarian. Right. And we have to raise our game. And that's why I think that, this is not going to stop. The incumbent industry is, its days are numbered, okay? Because there's just the recognition that we can do better. Mm-hmm. And not just in a philosophical way, but, we can do better in delivering for consumers and, all the ways that matter to success. And there have been probably dozens of new startups basically that are jumping in. Right. Because they see this opportunity, which I think is great. I mean, and the meat industry is running scared.
So on the one, I get that completely. So there's this shift. Part of it has been pioneered by you guys in terms of delivering, something truly better. but there's also kind of been a shift maybe on the consumer side. So, looking at the current environment, I was just reading a Financial Times article that since the coronavirus kind of pandemic time, plant-based meat sales have gone up like 265%. How do you react to that? Is it an awareness thing? Is it something that's been going on? Or are you doing something different?
Yeah, I think it's not just, okay, that's actually a good point. I should have addressed that as well. So there has been an ongoing trend among consumers, and a lot of it is sort of demographic. It's particularly in the kind of, college and underage group, where I think that they're growing up in a world where basically they're saying, look, the boomers have fucked it up, okay? And, they're realizing that the world that they're going to be living in for the next, decades is really looking ahead at catastrophic problems. And their investment in addressing environmental issues is vastly higher than preceding generations. And even among, my generation and so forth, that awareness has grown. And we monitor this obviously in our research. And we see when we first started, the environment wasn't in the top 10 list of reasons of why people might choose our product. It was deliciousness, health, nutrition value, animal welfare, stuff like that. Now it's number 3, okay? I think people have really woken up to the fact that business as usual is going to end very badly. And that increases their receptivity. Second thing is, it used to be the information you got about the incumbent industry was curated by that industry. Basically, the mass media, there were very few channels for learning about this. And the incumbent industry had the resources to make sure that they controlled the message very well. I think now people have alternative ways of getting information about what's really going on in the world, and their awareness of, the environmental impact, the public health impact, the atrocities, animal welfare atrocities that go on in the animal-based food industry and so forth, they haven't been able to be contained by that industry. So I think that there's much greater awareness, not just of the importance of solving these environmental problems, but that actually the animal-based food industry is really needs to be taken down, basically. That's broader than just young people and people who care about the environment. I think that the COVID thing, I hope to some extent, has woken up people to the fact that the majority of the new emerging viral epidemics are directly traceable to the use of animals in the food system. Influenza epidemics almost always start in pig and poultry farming operations. That's where every year the new epidemic strains arise. The famous 1918 pandemic started. People point to Spain. It actually started in Kansas in a poultry farm, and that's pretty much where they trace. And those are, to public health people, like the nightmare scenario is 1918 all over again. Well, we're kind of getting that with COVID. But if you look at where did Ebola come from, it came from eating bushmeat, basically, in Africa. Where did HIV come from? It came from eating bushmeat in Africa. Where did SARS come from? Came from a wet market in China. Where did COVID-19 came from? Same deal, actually. So, and of course, all the antibiotic resistant pathogens that are probably the next biggest public health threat that people in that world are wringing their hands about, those are being incubated in farms where antibiotics are non-therapeutic antibiotic use is common practice. So from a public health standpoint, my point is people are becoming more aware of these issues. I think COVID has helped that. And finally, now, I think an interesting thing is that obviously COVID has disrupted the meat supply chain,
Right.
but our supply chain, in a way, because we make it directly from plants, is inherently more robust, and also for other reasons having to do with the working conditions and so forth in our facilities. We're able to keep operating without an outbreak, and that issue has created gaps in the supply chain for meat, and meat consumers, seeing that there's no ground beef from a ground up cow, who otherwise are just going to run into the grocery store, grab it, and head out the door, are looking at alternatives. And like I say, we have very, data over long term that most meat consumers, when they try our product, become repeat customers. So I think that just the incentive to try plant-based products has really grown. And I think it's going to be sustained. That's the point. Once people try, most of them become repeat customers.
So we're close to opening it up to audience questions. A couple of more questions though before we move on. So slightly bigger picture issues. You've been criticized in the past for targeting the animal meat industry. I talked this over with you before also. Like, we see numbers that's been put out there that the meat industries, or the animal meat industry, is responsible for 5.5 million jobs, or 257 billion in wages. What's your response to that? Like, is that going to have, is the shift away from kind of the animal meat industry, animal meat products to products like Impossible or Beyond, is that going to result in kind of layoffs, job losses?
Okay. Boy, that's such a complicated issue. First of all, one thing I think, just for context, probably something close to a quarter of the people at Impossible Foods come from families that were or are active in farming. Okay, so we have no ill will toward farmers, and of course the most of the ingredients in our product, I mean, pretty much for all practical purposes, all of them come from farms. So those jobs, we are going to need farmers, no matter what the products are. But that's a little bit glib, okay? Because most farmers' wealth is in their land, and our production process uses less than 1/25 the land area, and this is a very good thing about it, to produce all the ingredients for our product, meaning that the requirement for agricultural land in the food system will be vastly reduced. That's part of what we're trying to do, as I just said, because that has huge opportunity costs for climate mitigation and biodiversity. But what it means is our success will inevitably devalue the major reservoir of wealth for a lot of farmers, okay? And we're actively thinking about how to mitigate that, and that could be another conversation. But in terms of the 5 billion jobs, I mean, that's a fake number. There are far fewer than 5 million jobs directly connected to the meat industry that aren't trivially adaptable to other things. I mean, if you work at an animal-based meat counter and what goes into that counter is plant-based, okay, well, we still need you. If you're a trucker that's transporting food from farm to distributors or something like that, and currently it's animals, and in the future it's plant-based products, that job doesn't go away. there are several hundred thousand, depending on the estimate, maybe 350 to 500,000 people who work in slaughterhouses. Well, part of that, part of those plants is very specific to animals. It's basically the part where you drive cows into the door, stun them, stab them, put them on a hook, chop them into bits. We don't need that part. And we also don't need to have a part of a food production facility where there's shit all over the place, basically, which is true of slaughterhouses because the animals come in covered with their own feces. Not a good public health practice, I would say. But everything downstream of there, actually, a lot of it can be repurposed. And in fact, we have a co-manufacturer based in Chicago, sitting right on where the old stockyards are, OSI, that's producing burgers for us. And they're using, a lot of the same machinery and labor that was previously making burgers from cows for fast food joints, because it's, the process is, once you get rid of the slaughtering part, a lot of it is exactly the same. And the requirements, the infrastructure requirements are the same. But the other thing I want to say is, so jobs will change. Many jobs will change, but workers will still be required, okay? And our workers are much better paid, and the jobs are much safer than the jobs in a slaughterhouse. So from a labor standpoint, I think it will be a good thing. But we can't, and we care about trying to minimize the damage to the incumbent industry for all sorts of reasons. But when I replace an incandescent bulb with an LED, I'm not going to be held back by the fact that that means some coal miner is going to lose their job. I'm doing the right thing for the future of the world. And I'm trusting that, to some extent, the market will resolve the problem, and hopefully wise public policy will help.
Cool. So we are a little bit over time for our discussion. I'd like to kind of take a few audience questions, if you don't mind. So this is a question from Sarah Showax. Apologies if I pronounced that wrong. And Sarah asks, can you share the rationale for launching in higher end restaurants, moving to fast food, and only now coming to retail distribution? Did that help you meet demand as you scale? Looking back, is there anything you would change in terms of Impossible's go-to-market strategy?
Very little, if anything. The rationale was this. When we started out, we didn't start out by throwing up a humongous factory and use that to produce the very first burger. We started out with a small-scale production facility that was basically the size of a garage, and it had the capacity to serve maybe a dozen small restaurants. And the most important thing that we could get, the amount of money we'd make from those sales was for all practical purposes negligible, even if it was like the only thing sold in the restaurants. The value we would get from those sales is awareness and building the brand, okay? And the awareness in particular that we wanted to build was that to address the biggest barrier to meat lovers eating a plant-based product, which is the assumption that delicious meat has to come from animals. And so we deliberately launched not just in small high-end restaurants, but in restaurants that are run by some of the most recognized and iconic meat chefs in the world. The very first one we launched in was a restaurant run by David Chang. When I told one of my Stanford biochemistry colleagues that we were launching with Dave Chang, this colleague, by the way, is a hardcore meat guy. He has a picture of bacon on his office door. When he heard that, he said, "Dave Chang is my God." And the basic point is that we wanted to launch with chefs who put their reputation on the line, and they have a very high reputation. They put their reputation on the line when they serve when they put a product on the menu and when they serve it to their consumers, they have a lot at stake. And we didn't pay these guys to serve our product. We just demoed it to them, and they, were wowed by it and wanted to put it on the restaurant. But we were going after those chefs in particular because we felt like there's no better way to effectively send the message to as broad an audience as possible that this is something different. This is delicious meat made from plants and not a veggie burger. Then when we got a little bit bigger, one of the messages we wanted to send was that this is not intended to be a niche elite product. We had to charge, a reasonable price for it so that we're not just flushing money down the drain. But that really was a minor part of it. We were being served in restaurants where everything on the menu, because of the economics of those restaurants, which are high-end restaurants, is relatively highly priced. But we didn't want to stay in that place. And so we launched in a couple of small burger chains. And then when we had the ability to support the scale, we launched in White Castle because we wanted to demonstrate that this is not going to be a niche phenomenon. They sell the Impossible slider for $1.99, and they make money on it, and we make money on it. So we wanted to send the message as broadly as possible that this is coming. This is not a niche product. It's good enough to be served in these incredibly elite Michelin star type restaurants, and affordable enough to be served in White Castle. So a lot of those choices were basically not driven by optimizing for the margin we get from our sales. It was optimized. The real margin we get is awareness and brand building, and particularly awareness that delicious meat doesn't have to come from animals, and that this is coming your way, basically.
Sure.
And retail, by the way, restaurants are totally different because they're when you eat them it's more of an event when you go to a restaurant. You're more likely to be there with people other than your immediate family and share food and so forth. And you have someone on site whose job it is to prepare the food in a way that optimizes it for you and also to advocate for it, which you don't get in a grocery store. It just basically sits there in the counter. So it's just not a good way to launch a food product in my mind.
This is a question from Brian Klein, who is University of Chicago undergrad and now current Booth student. And Brian asks, can you comment on lab-grown meat and its potential impact for Impossible? It also satisfies kind of the environmental, morally good aspect while being what he calls actual meat. There's a little bit more beyond that, but just quickly.
Well, I mean, I could give a longer answer to this, and hopefully shut me off if I start trying to. But basically, there's zero chance that there is no such thing as lab-based meat. Okay, that's something to keep in mind. There are very small scale experiments where people take cultured cells that don't make tissues like meat or taste like meat and mix them with various binders and produce, some blob of purported meat that's the size of your pinky. That is not lab-based meat. And the problem is that the economics, you can't get there from here in terms of the economics. Think of it this way: if you could make a cultured tissue that replicated the properties of any macroscopic tissue from an animal, would you sell it for $5 a pound as meat, or would you sell it for $1 million a pound as a therapeutic, as a treatment for muscle wasting or something like that? I think you'd start doing the latter, but that industry doesn't exist because fundamentally this is really, really hard to do. And the other thing is that when you think about the economics, you are trying to do something that's effectively having to raise your cow as tissue in an intensive care unit where you're feeding intravenously, so to speak, and it's immunodeficient. It has no immune system. So you are completely responsible at a huge scale for preventing any viruses or bacteria from getting into that space. That is incredibly expensive, and it has a big environmental footprint. And the last thing is, if 200 years ago, the lab-based meat concept were being applied to transportation, someone would have the genius idea of saying, you know what, horses are too high maintenance. I have a genius idea. I'm going to culture horse muscle cells and hook them up to gears and pulleys. And that's the transportation system of the future, okay? But the error, the fallacy there is that you miss the big opportunity, which is if you step away from the assumption that the only way you can make things move is with a horse, or the only way you can make meat is with a cow, now you have a much higher degree of control, and you can optimize and optimize and optimize. When the flavor is as good as the best tasting cow you ever ate, the next day you're working on making it better. You're not stuck with all the nutritional baggage of making your food from animal cells and so forth. And the fact is, going through animal cells to turn plants into meat, by any mechanism whatsoever, you take a huge efficiency cut. We get 100% efficiency in turning soy into our product, for example. So it's never going to be a thing. Okay, that's the bottom line. And I love the fact that people are trying to do this because their heart's in the right place, but it's never going to be a thing.
So we're almost to the end, but before we sign off, I had warned you that I would ask you this question. So what keeps Pat Brown up at night, or what do you dream of? Like either question.
Well, it's an interesting question. First of all, one thing I'll just say, and I know it's a metaphor, but I never have trouble sleeping. I mean, usually I'm so sleep deprived, the minute the room goes dark, I'm out like a light and don't wake up until my alarm goes off. So, but that's not what you're talking about. But no, I think that the thing about doing this is that I knew going into it, everything about it is hard, okay? Everything, we have to grow on average twofold every year for the next 15 years, okay? We have to grow in the next 15 years to be able to, you know, replace $1 trillion industry to produce more than £1 trillion a year of products, get them around the world, make a diversity of products, and continue to optimize the whole system. And we're going to face things like the COVID pandemic, you know, people trying to throw legal obstacles in our way. We knew that going in, okay? So it's never going to stop. But in a way, I love it. Bring it on. You know, it doesn't mean that it's easy. It doesn't mean that you're kind of like, whoa, how are we going to solve this? But I mean, that's part of the deal. You know, if you're going to try to do something that is, you know, world changing, and it's never going to stop. The challenges are never going to stop coming your way. Unexpected challenges, expected challenges. I mean, it's actually part of the fun of doing this. Obviously, I want to succeed. If it was as challenging as snapping my fingers and suddenly the whole animal-based food industry goes away and magically gets replaced, oh, I'd instantly do that. But it's not all bad to have these things coming your way. It keeps it interesting.
Yeah. On that note, I think we are out of time. I just wanted to know that there's, I don't know, hundreds of questions that came up that we obviously won't be able to get to. I'm sure we'll forward these questions to you and to.
Yes, I'm happy, and I apologize. You know, I have warned Sanjog that I tend to be a little bit tangential, and you just realize how true that is. So I apologize to anyone who didn't get their question answers, but yes, please do send them to me, and I'll try to get back to you.
Okay. Well, once again, thank you, and I'm going to hand it back to Christina to kind of close it out.
Thank you, Pat and Sanjog, for such a meaningful discussion. So interesting, and you know, someone who works a lot with entrepreneurs. So many lessons to be taken away. And thank you to all of you who joined us. I hope that today's event inspired you, maybe even to work towards worldwide impact. I think we need more inspired people heading in that direction. Before leaving today, I just want to share some quick information about some of Rosandi Center's COVID-19 efforts. We have been facilitating something called Booth COVID-19 Volunteers, a new pro bono consulting program to connect Booth MBA students with Chicago nonprofits, government agencies, and social enterprises in need of strategic support due to COVID-19. Since March, the Rosandi Center has actually matched nearly 50 student volunteers with nearly 30 social sector organizations. You can visit the Rosandi Center's website to learn more about how students are helping to address some of Chicago's largest social impact challenges during this crisis. And any Booth students out there, you can also reach out if you're interested. Further, the University of Chicago's Poverty Lab and the Rosandi Center have been conducting joint research projects to better understand the impact of COVID-19 crisis on small businesses and households. And you can find the latest information on the studies and the findings on the Rosandi Center's website. And you can actually check back for regular updates as we continue to learn more. Lastly, we would love to get your feedback on today's event and your input on what events you might like to see in the future. When you exit this call, a link will appear with a feedback survey. We would really appreciate it if you take a moment to fill it out. With that, that's it for us today. Thank you so much for being with us, and we hope to connect with all of you again soon. Take care.
Working on Impossible Foods, go to our website or send us a message. We'd love to have some super smart Chicago students coming our way.